But really what I wanted to talk to you about today is not about our products. Progress is a 40-plus-year-old software company. We create technology that allows you to develop, manage, and deploy responsible AI applications and experiences. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today is accessibility, and I think it dovetails very nicely into what we just heard, because you can have all the personalization in the world, but if your users can't access what you're trying to share with them, none of that matters. So I actually invited Neil Milliken to join me on stage today. Neil is the Vice President and Global Head of Accessibility and Inclusion at Atos, and a member of the Atos research community. With more than 2 decades in accessibility and assistive technology, he has served as an expert for the W3C Cognitive Accessibility Task Force and is on the Leadership Council of the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, as well as holding several advisory and non-executive roles. He's also the co-founder of AXS Chat, an award-winning podcast on accessibility and inclusion. Neil is dyslexic and has ADHD and advocates for the neurodivergent and others with disabilities. Welcome, Neil.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to point out that you've been a guest on my podcast, and it's been a pleasure to have you on. I think I'm everybody's worst nightmare at a marketing conference, which is an amateur that has won a marketing prize, so thinks that they know it all. Accessibility is actually extreme personalization, but to Rasmus's point, our definition in the accessibility world as to what personalization is somewhat different from what it is in the marketing world. But the common thread is that we are trying to communicate in a meaningful way.
Absolutely. And you know, there are 1.3 billion people in the world with some form of disability. In the UK alone, there are 2 million people who have visual impairments. There are 12 million people with auditory issues. So it really reasons that it's imperative that your digital experience is and your customer experience is accessible. And our reliance on technology as a society has skyrocketed since COVID. So if you're not thinking about accessibility, there's a very, very, very good chance that you're missing a large portion of your audience. So you'll hear both of us say probably a lot today, or at least me, accessibility is the right thing to do, right? I mean, take away everything else. It's the right thing to do. However, it's also an incredibly important thing to do from both a business and brand experience perspective. So Neil, maybe we can start with some basic information about what are some different disabilities, and maybe provide some examples of how that could hinder your digital experience or customer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So disability is incredibly diverse. It goes from visual impairments, hearing impairments, to my own conditions such as dyslexia. You have mobility impairments. Even pain is an accessibility issue, because if you've got a mobile app that is asking people to reach or do repetitive actions, you could actually be stopping someone from completing the thing that you want them to do. And accessibility is just about enabling that extreme personalization for that individual that enables them to complete what you want them to do and what they want to do. So it's that meeting in the middle. So if someone is blind, they will use a screen reader. That means that they're not seeing any of your content, that it actually sort of scrapes the screen, and it is using the structure of the web page or the app to be able to enable them to navigate and access that information. If you don't follow accessibility guidelines, they will get lost in your document. You will not get your message across, and ultimately you won't get your sale or the transaction that you want. And this is a large segment of the population. We're talking about between 15 to 20% of the population, trillions of dollars in expendable income, and also the halo effect of people's friends and families, because when people are excluded, their families also go to where they can be included. So it's really important. Thinking back to my own condition, dyslexia, making sure that stuff is easily understood and communicated well. The most common thing of all, the most common accessibility issue of all is color contrast. Actually, people just not giving sufficient contrast for anyone to be able to read a document properly, or a web page or an app. So really simple things like that enable people that don't even consider themselves to have a disability to engage with content.
Yeah, and that's great. I think some of the things you and I have talked about in the past are that there are ways that people are doing it well. So you've talked about screen readers, but then there are also ways where their intent was good, but it hasn't quite met the mark. And so one of the examples I shared with you, I think, on your podcast was personal to me in the sense that my daughter just graduated high school, but last year, they had a portal that you could go to as a parent, and I could see how much school she had missed. I could see her grades. I could see all sorts of information. And they had an icon on the top right that was allowed you to enable accessibility features. The problem with that was that you could only move it into one of each of the four corners, and every place you moved it, it covered up a key function within that portal. So their heart was in the right place. They were doing something to try to make that portal accessible to all parents, right? And however, by doing so, they ended up actually making it a jarring experience for everyone. Do you have examples of organizations that are doing something like that right?
Goodness, so the overlay example that you give is prevalent because people want to find an easy solution.
Right.
And I think that the heart is in the right place, as you say, but it actually is that experience that gets in the way. I think that really you need to take a user-centered design approach to when you're conceptualizing your web page or your app. It doesn't actually cost much more to make something accessible. The return on the investment you get is good. So a good example of well thought out and realized design, BBC, they have exceptional, they have what they call the global experience language. And it's freely available in GitHub, so you can go and have a look at all the design patterns. And all of these are there to create a coherent look and feel, coherent ways of interacting, but also ways of interacting that work with things like assistive technologies that take into account that people might change the colors and the backgrounds and all sorts of other things so that they can include the widest possible audience. And they're not driven by regulation because actually, funnily enough, they're exempt from some of the laws on accessibility, but they are driven by their obligations as a public broadcaster to reach the widest possible audience.
Well, and it's interesting that you mention laws and regulations because that is becoming increasingly more, where we're seeing that more, right? Regulators are no longer waiting for voluntary action from corporations. In fact, in the US, in 2022, US Congress introduced the Websites and Software Applications Accessibility Act, which is with parallel bills in both the House and the Senate. The European Accessibility Act actually goes into effect in 2025, placing further requirements on both public and private organizations to provide equal access to digital services for all, regardless of ability. Can you tell us a little bit more about the European Accessibility Act and what people should expect if they haven't done something right now, what they should be thinking of, and what the implications are if they're not compliant?
Yeah, sure. So it's a pretty far-reaching act. It's covering operating systems, apps, banking systems, self-service machines. It's also covering communications and content for those digital services. Now, implementation date is June 2025. For new products, there is a period of time for older products, but essentially, if you have a product that falls into the categories that are covered, and they're pretty broad, you will need to comply with this if you want to sell your product or service in Europe. And all of your documentation about your product and service also needs to be accessible. So if you're a bank, you need to make your website and your app accessible, but you also need to make all of the blurb that you're sending your customers accessible as well. So banks right now are busy looking at just the hundreds of thousands of PDF documents they've got outlining the sort of brochures and all of this kind of stuff because they need to be accessible. Frankly, they needed to be accessible a long time ago because they were covered by vulnerable customer regulations and everything else. The difference is with something like the EAA is that there is enforcement. This is the first piece of accessibility regulation where the member countries of the EU have to set up enforcement bodies. So it's designed to actually be enforced in a way that many of the other regulations hadn't been until this point. Now, I'm doing a lot of studying on regulations because I work in 70 countries. We identified 300 different bits of regulation relating to disability and non-discrimination. This is one of the few where you risk being excluded from a market entirely if you don't meet the regulatory requirements. So there are standards that apply, and if you comply with those standards, you get a CE certificate. Now, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the CE certificate, but that's a conformity certificate. If you don't have a CE certificate, you cannot sell in the entirety of Europe. So what you risk is not so much the fines, it's the exclusion from the entire market. So this is really quite serious. Being really honest, I don't think that the enforcement is going to be overnight, but I do think that what you're going to see over time is some significant test cases where organizations suddenly find that they're unable to sell their products in the EU without making significant changes. So my message to anyone here is start working on it now, because the earlier you start on this, the less it costs you, and retrofitting these things is much harder.
That's great advice and great information. I think, so that you can take that into consideration when you're thinking about your customer journey. Obviously, that should be part of it. Accessibility should be a first-class citizen in those conversations and strategies. But one more quick question. So many of these people in the room are also responsible for purchasing marketing technology and even building out their own stack. What should they be looking for in products that they're purchasing to ensure that they are also compliant?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is something called an accessibility conformance report. Now, this may also be called a VPAT, which is the name of the template that companies fill out that tell people how well a product conforms with the standards. And there are certain things that people should look for. I'm not expecting anyone in this room to be an accessibility expert, but you can check certain things to do the sort of sniff test on some of these statements. So you can check whether or not the conformance statement is for the current version of the product, how old that conformance statement is, whether that was written by the marketing department or whether it was done by experts, what technologies they used to test. So if they actually used assistive technologies rather than automated testing tools, then it's likely to be a better quality of report. And then there are certain things that you can say that it conforms, it doesn't conform, so partially conforms, or it's not applicable. And the sort of partial conformance is the one to look out for, because the devil is in the detail, because it may well be that partial conformance means that someone can't use some of the really significant features. But you don't have to be an expert to have at least a good idea of the sniff test on these things. And then you can engage in with your procurement people and ask further questions. And if necessary, go out and find an independent accessibility expert that can give you some advice, because there are experts out there that can provide you with some good, solid advice.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. As I mentioned, we have a Progress has a booth. We can talk about all of our products there as well, but really wanted to take the time today to talk about, as I said, accessibility is a topic that is something that we focus on all the time at Progress, and something that we thought we wanted to share with this group. So Neil, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for being here.